Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this class, I'm going to be teaching you how to sew an all-in-one facing. Now, an all-in-one facing is a facing that finishes both the neckline and the armholes of the garment at the same time. So it's really great to use on sleeveless garments. In this class, I'm going to be showing you two different methods for sewing an all-in-one facing. Method 1 shows it with a centre-back seam in a garment. Method 2 shows you where you don't have a centre-back seam in the garment, so the centre-back can be cut on the fold. For this class, you will need to have your exterior pattern as well as your facing pattern, but if you want to draft an all-in-one facing for your garment, I do have a tutorial that shows you how to do that, and I'll pop a link to it here. The other thing to note is that this class is solely focused on sewing an all-in-one facing. If you want to understand a little bit more about the order of construction, or perhaps you have an invisible zipper in your garment and you don't know when you should be introducing that, I do have a class called the How to Sew a V-neck A-line Dress, and in that class I show you how to sew the entire dress. I'm using a lining instead of a facing, but I am using the all-in-one facing technique for a centre-back seam. So it might be useful if you want to understand a little bit more about the sewing processes involved with the rest of the garment. In the meantime, let's grab your patterns and we can begin.
I've gone ahead and cut out a back and a front from a basic bodice pattern.
I have one version that has a centre-back seam and one version that does not. I will talk through both of them in this class. Depending on the pattern that you're working with, you may need to sew some things in preparation to finish the neckline and the armholes, such as the darts that I've sewn in this front bodice. You will also see that I've applied some stay tape at the neckline of both the front and the back of the garment. I would also do this to the armholes in both the front and the back of the garment. If you don't have a fusible stay tape, then you can use stay stitching instead. Then you will have your facing patterns. I have my front facing cut on the fold, and one version I would have my back facing with a centre back seam. The other I have my back facing cut on the fold. The facing pattern might be based on a pattern that you're working with, or you can draft your own, which I show you in the video I linked at the start of this class. These facing pattern pieces would usually be interfaced, and most of the time I'm going to want to use a nice relatively lightweight interfacing because I don't want the facing here to have a huge amount of bulk over the upper part of my garment. Usually I'm working with a quality fusible woven interfacing that's nice and lightweight. Of course, the interfacing weight and quality that you want to use will depend on the fabric that you're working with. Remember that if you're completing this method, you can also have a lining that will attach to the facing along this bottom edge. Step 1, whether you're working with a centre-back seam or a centre-back cut on the fold, is to sew the shoulders together of your garment. You're going to want to be sewing the shoulders of both the facing and the outer garment. Take your front facing pattern, position this on the work surface with the right side facing up. Then take your back facing patterns and position these with the right sides facing down, so the right sides of the two fabrics are facing one another, aligning the shoulder seams. You can pin these, or you can simply take them to the sewing machine and sew them. I usually sew my shoulders from the neck out to the end of the shoulder. So I'm pinning both of these shoulders in that manner, with the pins on the side of the work that I'm going to be placing on the top of the sewing machine. For your exterior garment, you will position the right side of your fabric facing up on your work surface, take your back, whether that's in two back pattern pieces or one that's been cut on the fold, and align this placing the right sides of the material together. Align the shoulder seams, and once again, I will pin mine so that I'm sewing from the neck edge out towards the shoulder. At the sewing machine, you would sew your shoulder seams of your exterior fabric and your facing or lining as normal. Follow the seam allowance in your pattern, start with a back stitch and end with a back stitch. We can then work to press those seam allowances open or towards the back of the garment, depending on your pattern. I'm going to be pressing mine open in both the exterior and the facing or lining. Once you have the shoulder seams sewn in the neck and the facing or lining, and pressed open or towards the back of the garment, we're then going to sew the neckline. Take your exterior fabric and position this with the right side facing up of the front and the back of the garment. Whether you have a centre back seam or no centre back seam, this step is the same. Take your facing or lining and position this with the right side facing down so the right sides of the two fabrics are together, aligning the neckline. And you can pin the two layers together around the neckline. It's really important that you align the two shoulder seams directly on top of one another. To ensure a perfect match at the shoulders, you can use a clover fork pin if you like. This pin is positioned either side of the seam you wish to match and is designed to be sewn over. However, you do need to be really cautious as you're sewing over this. If you're working with a more complicated neckline, such as the point of a V-neck, you may wish to draw on your stitching line. Otherwise, we're going to take this to the sewing machine and we are going to sew around the neck. For a garment cut with the centre back on the fold, you can start at the centre back or at one of the shoulder seams. Sew around the neckline at the sewing machine, following your pattern's seam allowance. Start with a back stitch and end with a back stitch. So once the neckline has been sewn all the way around, we're then going to do two things. One is to clip into the neckline, and the second is that you might need to trim and grade your neckline. So when it comes to clipping into the neckline, we're going to need to do that on the curves of the neckline to release the material so that when we turn this around to the right side, the material can sit flat. You're going to want to cut in towards the stitching line at pretty much a right angle to the stitching line from the edge of the seam. You can use a pair of snips or you can use a pair of scissors. You want to be cutting to the stitching line but not through it. I'm usually stopping about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away, 2 to 3 millimeters. You only need to be cutting on the curved areas of the neckline, so this will depend on your neckline shape. At the back of the neckline, I will have an area of curved neck, and because this is a round neck, I have more of a curved neck than I would have, say, on a V neckline. If you're working with a fabric that frays quite a lot, you can also choose to stagger your clips or cuts in the two layers of material. What I mean by this is that you will cut in one layer, say the facing first, and then you will cut in the exterior fabric only in a slightly different place. Depending on your neckline and the size of your seam allowances, you may need to trim and grade your work. And you can choose to trim and grade prior to doing your clipping or afterwards, it's up to you. If you're working with a small seam allowance, such as 5 millimeters, 1/4 of an inch, even up to 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch, then you can often get away without doing any trimming or grading. But anything larger than 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, you will absolutely need to trim your seam allowances. And if you're working with thicker fabrics, you may need to do some grading. So I could choose to trim both seam allowances here down to a generous 1/4 of an inch, 5 millimeters. If my seam allowances were quite bulky and I also wanted to grade them, the rule is that you must always grade or cut the seam allowance smaller that's going to be at the back of the garment. In this case, that's the facing. It's on the inside of the garment once the seam is sewn. So I would only trim at the facing, and I could do that to about half the distance. So a generous 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters. Using a smaller pair of scissors like this will make that easier. Whether you need to do this or not does depend on the fabric that you're working with. You can always move your fabric back to the right side to see how it feels. Depending on your neckline shape, you may also want to press open the seam allowances around the neckline. Once you've trimmed or graded your seam allowances as your fabric requires, the next step is that we are going to understitch the neckline. What this means is that we are going to sew on the facing or lining side of our neckline, quite close to the neckline seam between the two fabrics, approximately an 1/8 of an inch away, 2 to 3 millimeters. When we sew this, we are going to push the seam allowances towards the facing or lining so that we are catching them. This helps to keep the facing or lining out of the way, making sure that it's not visible on the right side of the garment. Now, because I have a centre back seam in this garment, the one thing I am going to do with my understitching is I'm going to start a bit of a distance in from the edge. My seam allowance is 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to start 1.5 centimetres 5/8 of an inch in from the edge. This can just help to create a neater finish when you insert your fastening, whether that's a zipper or whatever method you choose. At the sewing machine, I'm going to use an edge stitching foot to make my understitching nice and easy. However, you can choose to use your normal foot, and you can use one of the edges on your normal foot instead if you prefer. I generally mark my starting point at the centre back with a pin or with some chalk so that it's symmetrical on both sides. If you're working with a centre back that's cut on the fold, you will complete the understitch all the way around the neckline. I'm going to move my needle here so that my needle is 1 or 2 points towards the layer of the fabric that I want to be sewing on. In this case, that's my facing or my lining. I will push my seam allowances towards the facing. I will begin with a back stitch, approximately 2 stitches, and I will start sewing. I will then work my way around the neckline, constantly checking that the facing seam allowances are going in the direction of the facing and that I'm catching them when I'm sewing. When I get to the end of my seam, if I'm working with an open centre back, I need to stop the same distance from the end of the seam that I did on the first side. Backstitch to secure. Once you've sewn the seam, you will be able to give it a nice press. Ideally, you want to press it with the facing or lining side facing up. You want to be able to see a very small amount of the exterior or right side of the garment creeping around the edge of the neckline. This ensures that you can't see the facing or the lining from the right side of the garment. Once you've sewn and finished the neckline and given it a good press, we're going to be able to proceed with our sewing. This is where the two methods differ. We will start with the method that has the centre back seam. To do that, you're going to want to once again position the right side of your garment facing up. You're then going to want to take the facing again and position this with the right side of the facing onto the right side of the garment, so aligning both of the right sides of the fabric together. And this is what we're aiming for here, a sewn armhole. So with the 2 layers of fabric, right sides together, we're going to pin around the armhole. For this method, we are going to align the shoulder seams once more and pin the 2 layers of material together around the armholes. Now this technique is different if your pattern does not have a centre back seam. I will show you how to do that in a minute. Once you've pinned around the armhole, you can take it to the sewing machine and you will sew it. You can use your clover fork pin if you want to ensure a perfect match on the shoulder seams. At the sewing machine, you will begin with a back stitch and you will sew following the seam allowance on your pattern. If you're working with a clover fork pin at the shoulder seam, you will sew over this very carefully. Back stitch at the end of the seam. Okay, so now we have 2 armholes that have been sewn. The next step would be to follow the same technique that we did for the neckline, which is to clip into the curves and trim and grade the seam allowances if required. To show you trimming and grading, I will do that to one side of my seam, but because I've got small seam allowances, 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch, and I'm using a lightweight material, I don't really need to trim. But let's say you're working with 1.5 centimetres or 5/8 of an inch in terms of your seam allowance, then you definitely do need to cut them down. So I've begun by trimming both seam allowances to a generous 1/4 of an inch, 5 millimetres. And now I'm going to trim the seam allowance that will be at the back of the garment, which is my facing seam allowance, to approximately half, 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimetres. I'm simply cutting the 1 layer of the facing seam allowance here, not both layers. And it's just important to follow that rule that the smallest seam allowance will always be at the back of the garment. You can think about this as sort of steps. If you had 3 seam allowances, the seam allowance that's facing the outside of the material always wants to be the longest because it wants to be covering the potential steps or different sizes of seam allowances behind it. Okay, so on this one side we have got our graded and trimmed seam allowance. On this side we just have the 1 centimetre 3/8 seam allowance. The next step is to clip into the curves, which I've started to do here. You can stagger this as I showed you with the neckline, or you can cut through both layers at the same time. As a rule, the tighter the curve, the closer the clips will need to be together. Now, I would recommend ensuring that you've got enough clips and you've done the trimming or the grading that you need prior to completing the next step, because it can be a little bit tricky to put the garment back into this position. The next step is to turn the garment around to the right side. With our centre back seam, we're going to do this by reaching up into the shoulder area, grabbing the back and pulling it through the shoulder. And it's pretty easy to do, especially if you have a reasonably sized shoulder in the garment. If you have a smaller shoulder in your garment, it can be a little bit trickier, so just take your time. Once you've pulled one side through to the right side, you will do exactly the same for the second side. We have the garment with the right side facing out on both the inside and on the outside. If you have a garment without a centre back seam, then sewing the armholes is going to be a little bit different. Prior to this step, you need to have sewn and understitched the neckline of the garment. Now you're going to place the garment with the exterior right side of the fabric facing up. Working from one side seam of the garment, it doesn't matter which armhole you do first, you're going to want to roll the fabric up. I'm rolling both the exterior fabric and including the facing on that side. And you want to make this roll relatively small, but it will depend on the size of your shoulder. The fabric that we're rolling up has to be small enough in size to fit inside the shoulder on the other side of the garment. Once your fabric roll is sitting in the middle of the shoulder, you're then going to lift up the exterior of the fabric to allow the facing from this side of the shoulder to move out of the way and also appear with the right side facing up. You will now take the facing, wrap it around the rolled up area of fabric from the other side of the garment so that your facing and your exterior fabric on this one side have the right sides together. The roll of the fabric is sitting between the two. You will then align the edges like you normally would, matching the shoulder seam and matching all of the edges together, applying pins as you need to. At the sewing machine, you're going to sew this armhole as a normal seam, following the seam allowances for your individual project. If you want to achieve a perfect match at the shoulder seams, you can use a clover fork pin. At the sewing machine, we are going to start with a small back stitch, and we're going to sew along the armhole, ensuring that we're following the correct seam allowance. Now, the most important thing here is that you don't catch that rolled up layer of fabric inside your shoulder. Depending on the size of your shoulder, if you're working with a narrow shoulder, this can become a little bit tricky. You need to ensure that where you're sewing, you're simply attaching the facing and the exterior material together. If you're working with a clover fork pin at the shoulder, ensure that you sew over this very cautiously. Sew around the rest of the armhole and backstitch when you get to the end. Now I've sewn one side of my armhole, I am going to need to trim and grade this as required. Because I'm working with a 1 centimeter 3/8 seam allowance and lightweight fabric, I'm not going to be trimming or grading this sample, but I did discuss trimming and grading with you when we sewed the neckline, and I also showed how to do it when I did the armholes for the centre back seam, if you wish to watch that. Position clips in around your armhole where you need them. As we previously discussed, you will need more clips around the curvier parts of the armhole. Give your seam allowances a press if you need to. Ensure that you're happy that you've done the trimming and grading that you need, as well as the clipping, because it will be hard to get back to this point. If in doubt, fold the bottom of the armhole around to the right side to check that you're happy with your seam allowances. Then we can turn this round to the right side. Grab the fabric that's rolled up inside the shoulder and pull it out of the shoulder. It does not matter which side of the shoulder you start, the front or the back. Keep working until the right side of the garment is facing out, and you can once again lay the garment flat on a table. To complete the second side, we're going to do exactly the same thing. You will position your garment with the right side of the exterior fabric facing up. You will roll the one side of the garment up from the side seam, including the facing and the exterior fabric, until your rolled area of fabric is sitting approximately in the middle of your shoulder. I'm then going to lift up my exterior fabric to release the facing that's sitting underneath so that the facing can come out and be positioned with the right side facing up. Then I'm going to take that facing, and position it with the right side of the facing against the right side of my exterior fabric around the armhole, matching the shoulder seam and all of the edges. And I will pin the 2 layers of fabric together, the facing and the exterior fabric. I'm using my clover fork pin at my shoulder seam, and now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I will sew it in exactly the same manner as I sewed the first side. Join me back here once you've done that. Here I've sewn the second side of my armhole, and I have also done my clipping that I need. If you're planning to trim and grade this, you would also do that now. Next, we will grab the fabric that's rolled up on the inside of the armhole and pull it through to the right side. Keep pulling until the whole garment is turned round to the right side. Of course, you may find that this adds a few creases to your fabric, depending on the fabric that you're working with. So I will need to give this garment a press. The next step is the same for both methods, whether you have a centre back seam or whether you don't. We need to sew our side seams and also understitch the armholes. So what's next? Well, we are going to need to understitch our armholes, just like we did for the neckline, to ensure that that facing or lining stays back inside the garment. But personally, I prefer to do this once I've sewn my side seams. I think it creates a neater result. So I'm going to sew my side seams next. If you're planning on finishing your side seams with the seam allowances pressed open, then you may wish to finish the edges with the overlocker or serger prior to sewing the side seam. Now you've got right side of your fabrics together here, sewing a side seam as normal. The only difference is that you have the seam for the facing or the lining at the underarm. Now ideally these seam allowances are going to both go towards your facing, because that's how we'll be sewing them with the understitch. That's not always possible, especially if you have some thicker fabric. In that case, I will align the join between the garment and the facing on both sides and send one set of seam allowances in one direction and one in the other direction. And when we're doing our understitching, we will still force the seam allowance on the side that's gone in the opposite way to come back to the facing. So you'll just end up with a little section of it under the arm that's going in the opposite direction. You can sew this on the seam as you normally would. Usually I would sew my garments from the hem up, backstitch at the start and at the end. Use your clover fork pin if you want to. Once sewn, you would press the seam allowances open or towards the back of the garment. If you're wanting to send both of your seam allowances towards the back of the garment, then you can run them through the overlocker or serger now and then press them towards the back of the garment. Here is an example. If you don't have an overlocker or serger, then you could choose to bind your seam allowances, use an overcast stitch on your sewing machine, or even trim them with pinking shears. Another option is to line the whole garment, and you could sew a lining to the bottom of this facing, or you could even use a lining throughout rather than a facing, completing this same method. And that is what I do in my How to Sew a V-Neck A-Line dress class, a step-by-step tutorial which I linked to at the start of this class. Once you've completed this for the one side, you would do the same for the second side. If you're working with a centre back seam, just check that you don't have the shoulder or the back of the pattern twisted. Okay, so now I have 2 sewn side seams. The next step is going to be to understitch the armholes on both sides. Now the rules for this are exactly the same as with understitching the neckline. The seam allowances will go towards the facing and they will be stitched a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters away from the seam between the exterior and the facing, looking something like this. Now, the key difference with your armhole is the shoulder area. Depending on the size of the shoulder of your garment will depend on how far you can get with your sewing machine. You probably won't be able to get all the way around. With a shoulder this size, I might be able to, but generally speaking, you want to aim to get approximately 5 centimeters, 2 inches away from the shoulder. Measure and mark your garment using a pin or chalk either side of the shoulder seam. For this garment, I'm going to be working with 3 centimeters, 1 inch and 1/4. The most important thing here is that you are consistent on both the front and the back of the garment. And you can either choose to start in the center and sew up to these points, or go from one to the other. Whatever works best for you and the garment that you're working with. If your garment has a narrow shoulder, it will be much easier to start
at the side seam and sew up on either side.
So I'm using the edge stitching foot, and I will move my needle exactly the same as the neckline, moving the needle by the same distance so that your stitching is consistent across the garment. What I mean by whether can I start at the top here of the shoulder, it really depends if you can get your foot and your needle into your fabric neatly, ensuring that you're only sewing on the facing, catching those seam allowances. Because the shoulder of this garment is quite wide, I can start there and sew all the way around to the other side. And I'm constantly pushing the seam allowances towards the facing as I sew this. When you get to the underarm, if your seam allowances were sent in the opposite direction, you simply want to pull them back in the correct direction as soon as possible. You can put an extra snip into the seam allowances to allow that.
Continue sewing around until you get to your marking before the shoulder seam. As you're sewing, do make sure that you are only catching the facing and those seam allowances. This can get a little bit trickier if you're working with a narrow shoulder. If you have a narrow shoulder, start positioning the needle directly in the seam at the side seam, complete 1 or 2 back stitches, sew up one side, back stitch, and then turn your work to the other side, moving the needle accordingly to sew from the side seam up to the second side.
You're going to want to press the armhole in position like we did with the neckline, ensuring that you can see a small amount of the exterior fabric from the wrong side or the facing lining side of the garment. Okay, so now we have both of the armholes finished, and this is what our garment is looking like from the center back and from the front. Now, the other thing we might want to consider with this all-in-one facing is about finishing the bottom edge of the facing. As we've discussed, you could in fact add a lining to this. But let's talk about some other ways that you could finish it. You could simply use the overlocker or serger.
Run the facing through the overlocker with the edge of the facing against the edge of the blade, so I'm not cutting any fabric away. And this is what it will look like. Now, you could choose to leave it as it is, or you could even press this under and edge stitch it. This is a common way that I finish my facings if I'm not planning on lining the garment. An alternative method is to complete a rolled hem or a baby hem around the bottom edge. You could also choose to add binding. To give you another idea, and this will depend on the interfacing product that you're using, you can sew the bottom edge of your interfacing and your facing together. This works for fusible or sew-in interfacings. Sew the facing and the interfacing with the right sides together. That would be the non-fusible side. Turn the materials to position the wrong sides together and iron if you're using a fusible. You can do this to the bottom of the facings prior to starting construction. My only piece of advice is you do need to be cautious doing this with a fusible interfacing in case the interfacing shrinks during fusing, which would distort the size and shape of your facing. I would recommend creating a test. Now, the final thing that I like to do is to anchor my facing to my seam allowances. I do this if I just have a facing, but I would also do this on the inside of the garment if this was fully lined. Connect the bottom of the facing to the back side seam allowance. Pin in position. You'll be sewing them together at the sewing machine with a basic bar tack or backwards and forward stitch. If you have a lining or a longer facing, you can connect the two side seam allowances together. When I pin these, I always like to check from the right side of the garment that I haven't distorted anything prior to sewing. At the sewing machine, I'm simply sewing a couple of stitches forwards, a couple of stitches backwards to anchor this in place. The most important thing is that you're not sewing through to the right side of the garment. You're simply attaching the facing to the seam allowances. You do not want this stitching to be visible on the right side of the garment. Once finished, it should look something like this. I've tried to keep my stitching on top of the overlocking or serging stitching on the facing. Of course, this would be really neat if it was in the same color. And there we have it, our sewn facing. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this class and that you now feel more confident sewing an all-in-one facing. I hope to see you in the next one.